Here we go again. Welcome back, my friends. Artist Journal, September 8th, 2025, broadcasting from the inner half of the nervous system. We're going to learn all about that this episode, and I am delighted to share all the latest discoveries here. My name's Adrian Pocobelli. Sailing forward, our electronic art orchestra here starting to fade. Courtesy of Tradscape, a wonderful artist out there on the blockchain. But here we continue our exploration, which began with Richard Hamilton. Interestingly, I never planned that. It was quite interesting how that just kind of appeared. And we're learning about the interiors. Just what is it about today's homes? I have it in front of me because I keep forgetting the title. I thought I had it. Just what is so different. It's a weird title. Just what is it that makes today's homes so different, so appealing? Remember that very famous collage by Richard Hamilton, right near the start, 1956. Interestingly, considered the father of pop art, but I was saying how you'll often find that image first or one of the first. This work here by Eduardo Paolozzi, who we're going to focus on in this episode, this is 1947. So almost 9 years before. Like, we're talking almost a decade before. Just what is it about today that makes today's home so different? Just what is it that makes today's home so different, so appealing? So quite interesting. And you do often find this the first, in your Taschen, pop art book that I used to have. You will find this to be the first image. So this is a collage by Eduardo Paolozzi. I have a very brief bio, which we'll look at in a second. But 1947. Now, what to note on this? So what do we see here? Kind of fairly simple, you might say, visual arts composition. A collage. We see here a woman, intimate confessions. So perhaps, an erotic theme, right? Here we see war, right? So, in Freudian terms, which we're going to see in a second, quite interesting, eros, and down here, one could argue Thanatos, but let's not even go that far, the death instinct, which Freud went deep into in Civilization and Its Discontents. But here we have a juxtaposition, perhaps most importantly, then we'll get to the Coke bottle in a second. Again, this is 1947, probably more than a decade before, Warhol, right? And out of the UK, by the way, the independent group, I believe that's what they're called. The independent group that was active in London between 1952 and 1955. Interestingly, stopping before the landmark exhibition. This is Tomorrow in 1956, considered the kind of founding pop art show. Again, this is 1947. Coke. Now, this isn't the first appearance of Coke in the visual arts, as we're going to discover here. But back to our work here. And let me just quickly see if, I believe I brought it up here. I Was a Rich Man's Plaything. Of course, the famous title, 1947. And actually, before we go there, artwork information and details, printed papers on card. So again, this is a collage, is what this looks like, of found, where Paolozzi would take found imagery that he would cut out, kind of scrapbook style, right? I mean, it's kind of that simple. Here you have a cherry, and you have food, right? Consumerism, real gold, kind of probably trying to sell something here. You have the pop here and the person with the weapon. Also here, you have consumerism and Coke. But I think the most important part of this, and this is one of the first, 1947 is when this whole series began, is the juxtaposition of Eros and Thanatos, I would argue, or the conflation of, sex and violence, to be blunt. The conflation, the juxtaposition, and mediated, via the mass media, right? Now you could say, okay, interesting, right? In a sense, you might even think like, okay, what makes this so revolutionary, right? Is this revolutionary? Yeah, okay, a different kind of imagery, but it's much deeper than that. Far deeper, actually. And the deepness, as we're going to see here, let me just bring up this work here first. So the first appearance of a Coke bottle from, as far as I know, and I think as far as the general understanding is, was actually Salvador Dali. Poetry of America, as you see right down here. This is 1943, by the way. As you see here, a little Coke bottle, can barely see it, but there it is, a Coke bottle put inside. Now, of course, Dali was creating these kind of, for lack of a better term, imagined landscapes, these inner landscapes, but really, created from the dream or inspired by dreams. Freud as well. But there's something different going on. What is the difference here? This is a very difficult question. And it actually took someone who had called The Insight of Ballard, once again, of J.G. Ballard. What is the difference here? And here, according to Ballard, which I think is correct, absolutely, insightfully, here we have a synthetic image. In other words, something that you are creating out of your mind's eye, or you're adding, fiction you could see as synthetic. Whereas here, we have something that's more analytic. Okay, this is more taking it from reality, mixing and juxtaposing, and what do we learn here? What are we seeing about ourselves, potentially? Right, so this you'd consider, it's taking found imagery. It's not creating a fiction. And for Ballard, who is kind of interestingly core to this whole discussion, this is a reflection of how, with the mass media growing after World War II and dominating in the 1950s, and these people saw this happen, right? So Eduardo Paolozzi, he was existing before, and all of a sudden you're seeing, yeah, of course there's radio, maybe there's some early television, but all of a sudden the rise of the mass media and all these magazines, kind of taking on a full dimension of reality. And with that, so all of a sudden taking that as the source rather than something you're creating, so to speak. And okay, making a creation out of these elements, but really distinguishing between something that you create and something that's analytic. Of course, we know, and I brought it up here, we know the difference, or the difference between analytic and synthetic cubism is helpful here. In analytic cubism, it is the earlier cubism where here it is about breaking down objects into multiple perspectives and analyzing their underlying structure. So you think of those kind of early, kind of brown and black, where we're going to take a table and then we're going to look at it from basically a whole bunch of different angles, and then we're going to kind of make it all into one work, right? And we're going to kind of combine all of these different simultaneous angles, up, down, side, diagonal, Synthetic cubism, on the other hand, building up images using simplified shapes, brighter colors, and often new materials. So building up, rather than taking apart, it's more about, that's where you'll see the collage elements of Le Journal on top of the Picasso, right? Of these kind of, that's synthetic cubism. And so that is a helpful, these are helpful terms to think of when we bring it back to, what is the difference between here? But you see, like, the birth, I don't want to say the birth of an analytic. This is analytic. This is more synthetic, but you're starting to see, in a sense, you see a movement in surrealism towards taking, so to speak, the furniture of our lives and discussing them and thinking about them. But they're doing it always within this kind of context of creating something, in a sense, new. In a sense, we're going to create this new landscape. Whereas here, this isn't really, yeah, you could call it a kind of new landscape, but this is more taking found elements and putting them together and saying, what do we see, right? Okay, so now this is quite interesting here as well. So right at the beginning of the collages, this is from the tate.org.uk, Paolozzi's collages. Who do we find? Can you see who this is? If you look closely, Dr. Freud makes his first flight at 70, and even getting on a plane, like the perfect image here. And again, a collage here. And then so you see, when you go back to this first image, the Eros and Thanatos, sex and death, violence, these things are, put it this way, one imagines this isn't an accident, okay? Like this is, you could even say, you know, how phallic is the Coke bottle? You can start to make these kinds of questions. You could say that with the plane, right? You can start to think about it. So super significantly, here is Freud actually juxtaposed with Einstein here, and with what looks like some anatomy and some interesting visual element here, right? And storage instructions. Again, so these collages. Now, who is Eduardo Paolozzi? So again, who is this guy who started before, like again, before the so-called father of pop art, Richard Hamilton, with 1956 is just what is it that makes today's home so appealing, so different. Here we have, who is this guy? Of Italian descent, this beautifully short bio here, courtesy of the National Gallery, I believe, in Scotland. Of Italian descent, Paolozzi was born in Leith near Edinburgh, so Scottish. He studied in Edinburgh and London and spent 2 years in Paris. And we're going to return to this. From 1947. And this is super fascinating as well. Because we saw Freud, we see the visit to Paris, and then we learn later that what Paolozzi saw himself as doing was a kind of new surrealism. A very, I would argue, and this just happens to be the guy who is a part of the independent group that Richard Hamilton is a part of. If you're looking for connections between surrealism and pop art, this is your bridge here. Eduardo Paolozzi, interestingly. And there you see it. Sigmund Freud. Let's continue, where he produced enigmatic bronze sculptures reminiscent of those by Giacometti. During the same period, he made a series of data and surrealist-inspired collages in which magazine advertisements, cartoons, and machine parts are combined, thus anticipating the concerns of pop art. Now, this is where the museums, I think, because there's been so many books written, and then someone is working for the National Gallery of Scotland, and then they go, oh, well, I can't say that he was a pioneer. You know, they can't start making it up because all of a sudden the scholarship will have said that, oh, well, actually, Richard Hamilton. Anticipating, as far as I'm concerned, to me, so we're going to call Richard Hamilton in 1956, that's pop art, but this isn't pop art. That was a collage too. It's even got pop right here, but he just anticipated. So this is why, again, I talk about the great revision in many things. This stuff is constantly being revised. I think the real founder here of pop art, to me, is actually super clear, which is Eduardo Paolozzi. And you see just how it comes almost directly out of going to Paris, same year. And again, you see the Freudian concerns here. Let's continue. Alongside teaching at various art schools, he developed his printmaking and sculpture. Paolozzi was particularly interested in the mass media and in science and technology, so in the big themes of his day. Now, this is interesting. So what was Paolozzi's connection to French surrealism? This is where ChatGPT really shines. Great question. It's deeper than many people realize. Early fascination, 1940s. As a young artist, Paolozzi was captivated by surrealism. While studying at the Slate School of Fine Art after World War II, he was devouring books, magazines, and reproductions of surrealist art. He was especially drawn to Max Ernst and Alberto Giacometti, whose dreamlike juxtapositions and fragmented figures influenced his own early sculptures. And again, you look at those collages, and you think of Max Ernst and the collage novels, the 3 collage novels, La Femme sans tête, right? The woman with 100 heads, but the woman with no head is the pun in French. La Femme sans tête, right? Parisiers. Paolozzi lived in Paris from 1947 to 1949. So he probably shows up and starts getting inspired like hell by who he's meeting, where he connected directly with the Surrealist circle. He met and socialized with Alberto Giacometti, Jan Arp, Georges Braque, of course the other Cubist, Constantine Brancusi, and Fernand Léger. He absorbed the automatist techniques, of course, as Breton defines surrealism. Automatism, pure psychic automatism, is the first definition of surrealism, which is long left behind, actually, by the time of Dali and later Ballard. Let's continue. He absorbed the automatist techniques, collage practices, and dream imagery of the French surrealists, though he was never formally a member of the movement. But that's like the fact that this has to be said shows how, actually permeated the scene there remarkably. Surrealism to proto-pop. Paolozzi translated surrealism into the post-war industrial consumer era. Instead of Ernst's forests or Dali's dreamscapes, he pulled images from American advertising, pinups, comics, and product catalogs. His bunk collages, which we're going to look at today, were surrealist in method, juxtaposition, chance, the unconscious, but with modern consumerist content. Again, this made him a bridge figure. If I'd start to actually call him the bridge figure, but let's see, maybe we discover something in a future show. A bridge figure between surrealism and pop art. Super interesting there. Is there anything more? His later sculptures, often mechanical, carry the uncanny, hybrid quality of surrealism. Echoing Hans Bellmer, incredibly controversial sculptor there, or Giacometti. Here it is. Even in the 1960s, Paolozzi described his method as a form of quote-unquote new surrealism, collaging the imagery of mass media to probe the modern psyche. So you see here, okay, a similar endeavor, but the focus has shifted from, in a sense, the world of dreams to the ongoing dream of the mass media, right? All of a sudden we have content here that we can analyze as if it's a dream and start to consider. So applying kind of similar techniques, again, collage, randomness, a kind of psychological, I was going to say analytic element, but that's not necessarily exactly what's going, but Freudian. Let's put it this way, a Freudian concern, a psychological art, so to speak, which again brings us back to these artists that are concerned with human nature. Again, you think of de Sade, but you also think of Henry Fielding. I mean, among many others. These are the artists, I would argue, and writers who we tend to remember, are the ones who really, penetrate deep into human nature and then come away with something that we learn. It's back to this, again, this qualitative science. Let's look at Bunk. So here it is. Now, Bunk, this is basically the collection of collages by Eduardo Paolozzi. In 1972, these were from 1947 to 1952, but in the early 70s, they were recollected because all of a sudden they were kind of brought out of obscurity for a Tate retrospective for Paolozzi. And all of a sudden it was like, wow, these were ahead of their time, weren't they? About this artwork, Eduardo Paolozzi had been making scrapbooks of exotic images from childhood. Once in Paris, his popular culture collages using American glossy magazines took on a new significance. Used in Paolozzi's groundbreaking 1952 lecture called Bunk at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, it was the first time that images from vernacular culture were treated as fine art. It is considered as the opening salvo of the pop art movement, so at least we're getting closer here. The publication of this material as prints 2 decades later reintroduced these images to a new generation who had grown up with pop. So quite interesting. So date 1948, and the collages were from 1947 to 1952. And did actually a whole lecture on this, which had mixed results. Some people, laughing and all this sort of thing. So here is one of these works. And I mean, what does that remind you of? It's kind of a simpler version of the Richard Hamilton, right? Of just what is it about today's homes just what is it that makes today's homes so appealing, so different? Like, I mean, here you see like the 1.0 of that kind of a simpler version in Ladies' Home Journal with this woman vacuuming inside. And again, you start to have this combination. You have these interiors. You have the psychologization, so to speak, of the image. And this erotic, arguably, probably at the time is how they're thinking of it, just this, adding the woman figure, and then how does this relate, as we saw with the fridge, with Hamilton's fridge, how does this relate to the external environment? Right? We see it here as well. And yeah, so with these kind of, you could argue, although it's debatable, you could start to say these are suggestive as well. Say the broom, even the vacuum cleaner to a certain degree. So interesting, right? So this is from, again, this is 1948. It's a psychological fact. Pleasure helps your disposition. Interesting title here. And we have a few works here. They're going to come up throughout the series. Now, here's the 1972 version, by the way. Screen print and lithograph on paper. So I'm not sure. I think they actually turned it into a print. Whereas I think the original, I believe, is a collage. View artwork details. I think we saw, it's going to be the same thing, like printed papers on card. So I think, maybe we'll just let that one go. So I think these are prints. Probably, again, probably cashing in to a certain degree. Nothing wrong with that. Putting out an edition, see that bunk book, and then I think there was something like 47 or 48 prints in there. Here's another one from 48. Let's see what it says here, because I think it's the same write-up for almost all the collages. But we see the woman, we see Mickey Mouse, orange juice, food, kind of almost abstract elements in the background, and then beautifully done, torn out, like this found image here, and then all kind of collaged onto that brown piece of paper. These collages are mainly made from magazines given to Paolozzi by American ex-servicemen. They show his fascination with popular culture and technology, as well as with the glamour of American consumerism. The title of the series refers to Henry Ford's famous statement that history is more or less bunk. We want to live in the present. It reflects Paolozzi's belief that his work should respond to contemporary culture. This could, Baudelaire made a point of that, I believe, in the essay The Modern Artist, but again, Ballard, a visionary present. Now, this Paolozzi super influenced Ballard. Now, I was looking up, there's kind of a bit of a fogginess, shall we say, in terms of when Ballard actually met Paolozzi. Interestingly, I thought I've read many times that he was at the This Is Tomorrow show in 1956, but when I asked ChatGPT, it says 1966 is the first time that they met, and they even collaborated, interestingly. In a magazine, I believe it was Ambit, where Ballard was the editor, and Paolozzi created images. But I mean, there is, again, this whole analytic here, again, we're back to the analytic side of things here when we look at this collage. For Ballard, maybe I explained this earlier, fiction had overwhelmed reality. Like, in a sense, all of a sudden, as he put it, the wildest fantasies of the surrealists were being outdone by everyday reality. You have these huge billboards with bodies, all across it, massive. You have the whole media landscape. You have, the Vietnam War again, and then you have a soft drink commercial. All these things, this kind of wild world that was being transformed by the mass media. What is the point, he asked the question, of adding more fiction on top of a fictionalized world? The role of the artist, again, he believed that these roles had reversed. The fictional was no longer in the inside of one's head, but in the external world, and that the reality now was inside. And that you have to, and so the role of the artist is to actually try and figure out what's going on in a world that's, overwhelmed by fiction. In his terms, to invent the reality. So this is what you can start to see is like, okay, right? It's like a scientist going out and trying to figure out what the heck is going on here. Well, let's use juxtaposition. Can we start to figure something out if we start taking things out of context and then we juxtapose them? Are we going to learn something about ourselves? And the answer, I think, is yes. The answer is yes. That's why it's tempting to call this a kind of qualitative scientific inquiry. Here, so and using randomness as well, okay, here's Minnie Mouse. If it was Mickey Mouse, would it matter? Okay, no, but now we see it's Minnie, and then we see this woman. Do we start to make connections? Then there's the tuna and the orange juice, and what's going on? So, right, Meet the People, interesting title. Here's another one, Dr. Pepper, 1948. And again, so this is an original, so to speak, collage. And quite an interesting image here, cut out. Not worrying, like from a technical perspective, quite interesting, where the temptation might have been to go right to the edge where you don't get that little white margin, but actually kept the white margin. A stylistic decision, interestingly, almost, perhaps to a certain degree. Maybe it was just practical. I'm sure it was. Just a practical decision, like, am I going to spend, 100 years, cutting this out super proper? But here, I mean, it's tempting, like at the front of the car, maybe that's kept on purpose, a kind of an artistic decision, I would argue. And a differentiator, which we should look at in another episode, is Max Ernst's collage novels. Maybe that's where we go next, where it's almost perfectly cut out to create these almost scenes that are these kind of, landscapes, so to speak, or narrative stage sets or scenarios. Let's call them scenarios. This isn't quite like that when we think of the collage here. This is not necessarily concerned with keeping a kind of space that is believable enough. This is more just like a one on top of the other, right? This is a small motorbike with a big stove, with a woman, like in a sense. This is almost what I sometimes call the sketchbook style, the compositional style, right? Where we're no longer creating a narrative space, or if we are, we're creating a different kind of narrative space than the three-dimensional space that we find in an impressionist landscape and everything else before. Right? So we do, the Dadaists, you might think, I think it's Raoul Hausmann. We can start to find antecedents to this. So it's not necessarily new with Paolozzi, but it's worth noting because it wasn't exactly super common either. So here's another one. And this is called Dr. Pepper. Of course, the soft drink there. And let's continue. Sac aux Sauce, 1948. So I find it hard to not consider these. If they're not pop art, then what are they? And I think probably what happened is probably a lot of this, especially back then, there's no internet. It probably just, it was probably a timing thing. And then all of a sudden, there's the big show, This Is Tomorrow, that became a historic show in 1956. And Richard Hamilton's collage there was in the middle, the heart of the action. And all of a sudden, that is the beginning. But I would argue a oversimplistic interpretation of what occurred here. I think clearly this is this is 1947, 48. That was 1956. It's like going 2025 and then something in 2034 was actually the beginning, right? That's the equivalent. Real Gold, 1949. So as you see here, signed as well, and we have Real Gold orange juice. And some lipstick, again, you have to always consider the Freudian aspect or interpretation to a lot of these things too. You have time, the woman, the hair, and another picture of the woman, again with a broom or a mop, and then there's the guy in his space-age sports car. But you see all of the elements here, the car, automobile styling, right? As Ballard would call it. Here's another one. Real gold. So looking like a magazine, or actually, you know what this looks like? Because there's the pulps, of course, pulp fiction, right? There's the science fiction pulps, but I guess there were other kind of pulps too, which were these kind of, magazines that you could read stories in the 40s and 50s. When I worked in a comic store as a kid, we had them. I actually recognized some of the covers here, not this one, but so you see a pulp. Pulp fiction, so to speak, with Mickey Mouse on top and some lemon juice, an ad, real gold lemon juice. And again, this wonderfully done element with the scrapbook, literally a scrapbook cover, probably being used as a background. Quite cool. 1950 wind tunnel test. And here we see another beautiful work, actually, so you just see a face and how it's being changed by a wind tunnel, basically being, brought right against it. So probably some sort of pseudo-scientific, experiment that's going on here. Again, interesting use of the blue here. This is quite interesting too. Yours Till the Boys Come Home, 1951. Again, this is on the tape. And here again, it's the same theme that we saw in our opening image here, which is the aircraft, war, fighter aircraft that actually looks like it's kind of falling apart. They look like they've been destroyed, juxtaposed with a woman's body and a bikini. And so, in other words, Eros and Thanatos, or war, or sex and violence, shall we say, or even war and Eros is kind of what it feels like with the mass media, via the mass media. This one I'm not sure if I remember, but I definitely remember Amazing Stories. And so this is actually, I don't think they necessarily got the credit. They were probably seen as simple, right? Okay, but this is actually beautifully done. Quite like ahead of its time in the sense of leaving this torn area here. We have to, again, remember the date on this. When you look at that Dali, that was just like 4 or 5 years earlier. These kind of super finished paintings. Even Dali in later years, like he used to make fun of Turner. Like if you read, The Secret Life of Salvador Dali or The Unspeakable Confessions or Diary of a Genius, which I highly recommend you do, you will see him trash Turner. Like as this kind of terrible artist and being like Raphael is the, greatest artist and Raphael's forehead and all this sort of thing. But even Dali eventually kind of broke and started putting ink splatters on the on paper, at least, say like his Inferno, for example, and then started building works with what he saw probably in the ink, and then started building around these kind of ink, but started to use randomness. He understood eventually the power of randomness. All to say, this isn't like, again, Rauschenberg comes much later. The American pop artists come much later. This is, again, what year is this? 1952. This is pretty radical, I would argue. This is pretty radical. We're using randomness and mass media stuff that nobody is caring about, and years ahead. This one, I wonder if I know. It looks like, I wonder if these look like two different covers. Now, interestingly, Ballard would later actually write for, I think, Science Fiction and Fantasy is what it eventually became called, what was eventually called here on the left. I had a Thrilling Wonder Stories. I don't know if it was that one. But I remember these pulps quite well. I had a few. So all to say, but science fiction, interestingly, playing a role here. And again, when you think of the weird Ballard connection, real gold. Sir Eduardo Paolozzi, 1949. So another work. Now I think we saw this one, didn't we? We saw this one, 1949. Now so here's the 1972 version. And as you see here, these are other collages that we didn't see from earlier. But you see, this was a thing that was put out. I wonder what this is. One of 50 deluxe copies with every sheet signed by Paolozzi except one. Like, I wonder what this goes for. That's like a whole interesting question in itself. And there you go. For Chris, Eduardo Paolozzi, 1972. And you see maybe some works we hadn't seen there before. Oh no, that is Freud. That is Freud on its side, interestingly. So different kind of portrayal here. And we may see some of these later. Again, what do you see here? War, woman's body. Okay? This is quite interesting. So going with the ancient and showing how, again, how the ancient imagery is being, I don't know if that's a Greek. It almost looks like, I don't know if it's Minoan, but it looks like some kind of figurine from, the not the Bronze Age, but the Iron Age. It's hard, potentially. Who knows? And so let's continue. Here, this is kind of later Paolozzi work. I don't think that's from the 40s. Look at this. I think I brought this up, though. Like, just taking it, like, pretty much directly, found image, there we go, done. So look at this. I mean, some of these just look like found works, which is probably why they're harder to find, because people are probably saying, well, like, this is probably an image. This is going, well, are these too simple? It's probably, or like, is this art, was probably what a lot of people asked at the time. And here, now these, of course, this is done in edition of 50. So these were likely, again, maybe screen print and lithograph or something like this, okay? They're signed prints. So these are the print versions of those earlier originals, okay? So, of course, we saw this. And again, kind of erotic imagery. This is actually, I remember the Planters Peanuts, at least the comics with those in, but they're probably from the 70s and 60s. So here we go. Just a few more here. Life magazine. Look at how awesome this is. Look at how awesome that is. So we are almost done here. Look at these juxtapositions here. Taking a milk ad, and then underneath, someone out at sea, maybe drinking, hard to say, or saving someone. Here, a plane, and then some sort of kitchen, scene. Super interesting. I do remember this. I guess it's Unknown Worlds. I remember this cover, famous cover. We had one of those at 8th Street Books in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Here's Popular Mechanics, 1951. So really trying to show the world that existed. And again, trying to understand, see what we can understand about it. In a sense, it's taking a surrealist perspective, but adding radically different content, but which actually made perfect sense. And you know what? I bet if Paolozzi didn't do it, someone else would have done it. It was just a matter of time before someone said, you know what? We have a collective dream that can be analyzed the same way we're analyzing our own reality with surrealist work. This is from Bunk, called Hi Ho. Again, kind of high and low, or at least, comic books as subject matter, pulps. Here are some others, and I think this is from the later version. So you see beans, right? A fridge. There is the car we were looking at automobile styling. It's probably what this is about, right? All of these curves, right? And you think of the Richard Hamilton, with the woman almost being fused with the car, right? War artists at work. Interesting. So kind of breaking apart the image a little bit. There's Planters Peanuts again. And this looks more like a screen print. This is from 1972 version. There's Time Magazine, right? So all very interesting. And finally, just a few others. So more war imagery, bomber planes. And I think, look at this, great. So you see some of them looking, like almost just taking the front page of a magazine and calling it an artwork. Quite interesting. Quite interesting here. So that is your show, my friend. I hope you enjoyed that. And until next time, take care.